Hello, this is Dr. Robert Guthrie, and we're back for another episode of our Bible study. That's the Sunday school class from Jerome United Methodist Church. The course is on lockdown for safety. So at this time, we're talking about Acts chapters 15 through 21. This is the third of our 4 episodes covering the book of Acts. And at the start, I want to go back to what the point I made before last week and the week before, is that Acts is not designed to be a detailed, comprehensive, historical account of the first century church. There really is no other account of the first century church. But it did account a lot of the things, but it wasn't as detailed and footnoted and all that as a modern history would be. What it really is the story of the triumph of the Holy Spirit. That the Holy Spirit comes to the apostles at Pentecost, a few days after Jesus had gone back up to heaven, and it empowers them to carry out his ministry, to teach and convert the people in the Jewish community, the Samaritan community, and then out to the Greek-speaking world of the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's given them the power to baptize people and pass the Holy Spirit on to the converts. So it really is the story of the triumph of the Holy Spirit. At this point, we're seeing the emergence. We saw the emergence of Paul about 6 or 7 chapters ago when he had been present at the stoning of Stephen and then was miraculously converted on the road to Damascus when Jesus appeared to him in a vision. And then he's become the principal evangelist to the Gentiles, or the Hellenists as they're called in my translation of the Bible. He was not one of the original apostles. He used the term apostle to describe himself, which was traditionally used for only those who knew Jesus in person. He said, I met Jesus on the road to Damascus. We can debate that one way or the other, doesn't matter. But he becomes the dominant figure in this part and the rest of Acts. And I do think that this section deals with the tension that grew up from Paul's ministry. When the original apostles took Jesus as the Messiah, it was a reform movement inside Judaism. And you were expected with the original apostles to obey the Jewish laws. Men had to be circumcised, you had to obey these very strict dietary laws, very strict ethnic laws, who you could associate with, who you could eat with. Paul knew right away that those were not going to be compatible with a significant mission to the Gentiles. Gentiles were not going to get circumcised as adults. They were not going to obey these unusual dietary laws. And so he had to find an accommodation. And in his letters, he says that the presence of a baptism, since you underwent baptism, that relieves you of the physical burden of being circumcised and of the physical burden of obeying the very strict dietary laws. But you do have major clashes which appear in Paul's letters. Now, Luke doesn't deal with them as clearly as Paul's letters do. Paul's letter, like I described Galatians, as a temper tantrum against Peter. A variety of the apostles would come along to certain places where Paul had converted a Gentile congregation and say, okay, now that you're a Christian, you got to get circumcised, you got to obey these dietary laws. Basically, you got to be a Jewish person first and then a Christian second. And Paul's saying, no. If you're a Christian, you're a Christian. Jesus came because the law could only condemn us. It could not offer us salvation through our faith. But what Jesus has offered us is salvation through faith. If we believe in him as the Messiah, as the Son of God, then we are saved, and the dietary and all the other laws become insignificant, not that important. Now, in other letters, Paul has to deal with the conflict of, well, you have a Christian that's really doing bad behavior, but it's for a different time. When Luke writes this, it's probably 10 or 15 years later, and he writes it 75 to 80 people. Nobody really knows, and Paul and Peter were probably executed about the same time in 64 AD in Rome under Emperor Nero, so this is 10 or 15 years later when those squabbles between Peter and Paul, they were rivals, not friends, have faded into history, and the Christian church is emerging more and more and more not as a isolated reform movement inside Judaism, isolated to Jewish converts, but includes not only Jewish converts, but a large number of Gentile converts. And it's becoming dominated more by the Greek-speaking, previously Gentile church of the Eastern Mediterranean and on off to Rome. And so probably when the time comes for Luke to write this, he downplays it. And what you have is a tension that started in Antioch when Paul had a congregation going there, and people from Jerusalem came there, not named in Luke. In Paul's letters, it was Peter and a few other people come in and try to impose the Jewish laws on him. So Paul takes another trip back to Jerusalem to have a meeting with the pillars, as he called them in his own communications. James, the brother of the Lord, Peter, and the other original apostles, the Jewish apostles. And I would suspect it was a fairly tense meeting, and it really required an enormous transformation on the part of the Jewish Christians. They had grown up in a very strict, very legalistic society. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. You can't eat with a non-Jewish person. You can only eat certain things. And so it was very difficult accommodation for them to move away from that and say, okay, you can be a Christian if you believe in Jesus as the Son of God. And they come up with a compromise. They have, in Luke's account here in Acts, Peter takes the lead to accommodate this, which he had been on the forefront of the opposition to it before. I think Luke's trying to downplay the deep tension that existed at the time, because the issue has become moot by the time Luke is writing this 10 or 15 years later, is the Gentile Christians are now dominating the Christianity. And so they come up with a compromise, which is proposed by James, in which you did not have to be circumcised, but the dietary laws simply that you were not allowed to eat blood, or animals containing blood. That's where the strangulation animals comes from. If the animal had been strangled rather than butchered, you wouldn't be allowed to have it. You weren't supposed to eat the food that had been sacrificed to the idols, and you could not participate in illicit marriages. This is actually the illicit marriage one is a tricky, very difficult, because the Greco-Roman world had wild sexual misbehavior, just wild. And it was difficult, and you'll see it in Paul's letters, is how do you accommodate the need to behave sexually somewhat, or reasonably well, as a Christian. And later in the letters, Paul says, don't worry about eating the food sacrificed to idols. The problem with that one was the only food available in most of the markets in the Greek world were animals that have been sacrificed to the idols. Paul says later, we know these idols are nothing. Don't worry about it. But they did make an accommodation, and Paul goes back to his missionary journeys and starts up again. He'd already done one. He goes back to Antioch and starts the second missionary journey into Asia Minor. Now, when the term Asia itself pops up in this part of the New Testament, Asia was originally just a small province in the west coast of Turkey, running from Ephesus up to Troy. Troy is where the Dardanelles come out. It goes, the Black Sea is to the north, the Bosphorus down to Istanbul. The Dardanelles is the passageway down into the Aegean Sea, part of the Mediterranean, and that's where Troy is. And so it's really from Ephesus up to Troy, it was one province. The name now means all of the continent of Asia, but in those terms, it was simply one province in the northwest part of what's Turkey now. And he starts on this journey, and he does a traditional pattern, as he does in all his missionary travels. He first goes to the Jewish synagogue and talks to them about Jesus and tries to convert them, and some convert and some don't. And then he will start a Gentile effort in these various other churches. And while he's on this journey, he has a dream. And he has of a person from Macedonia saying, come over to us, come over to us. So he crosses the water, the Dardanelles, into what's now Europe, and goes into Macedonia and then down into Greece. And he does his traditional approach. He goes to the Jewish synagogues, preaches there for a while. While is not defined in this. And then he goes on to convert the Gentiles. In Philippi, which is down into Greece proper, he converts Lydia, who was a Jewish lady who was very prosperous. She's a merchant in purple dye. If you remember that the color of royalty in Rome was purple, and so she was a very prosperous lady to be able to do that. And you're now seeing, as you get into the Greek world, some more prominent women, which had not been a part of Jewish belief at all times. So she says, "Oh, come and stay with us." So she apparently had quite the house that she could welcome all Paul and his companions in there. And then down in Philippi, while he's doing a lecture, there's a riot after he converts a slave girl. Some people had a slave girl who was a soothsayer who could predict the future, and she's following around behind Paul, saying that he's the representative of the Lord on high, Jesus, and she's following him around and saying this and bugging him. He turns around, and he has quite the temper, gets exasperated and casts the demon out of her, and suddenly her owners lose all this money. They were making all this money selling her predictions for the future. So Paul now finds, as we get into the Greek world, when you get into someone's income or pocketbook, that can set off a riot. And so they attack them, and they're basically having a riot, and the authorities have to come in and arrest them. They arrest them, and they flog them, beating them with the flogging, and then lock them in prison. That night there's an earthquake in the prison, and the doors are cast open, and the chains fall off. And the head jailer is getting ready to kill himself, because if the prisoners escaped, the jailer always gets executed. We saw that in the previous time when they escaped, when Peter escaped from King Herod. Herod had the guards executed because people would assume that the guards had let him out. And Paul says, no, we're still here, we're still here. So that person becomes a convert also. And when Paul tells the authorities they were going to release him in the morning just to let him go, he said, wait a minute, we're Roman citizens. Now, you couldn't flog Roman citizens without a trial. You had to. So he really had them over the barrel, and so they back off, and they're starting to be nice to him because he did not charge them with abusing a Roman citizen. It was actually a very helpful thing for Paul to be able to use that when people would get on his case. And he goes on down to other cities and continues his preaching, and some people accept him, others don't. There's other problems when he gets in argument with the Jewish people, who get often very angry at this, and he has to flee from town to town. And then in another town, they arrested him again in Corinth. He goes to Corinth. He ends up staying in Corinth about 18 months. It's one of his more successful mission fields. Actually, he had gone to Athens beforehand. I got to backtrack here. I got a little ahead of myself. He'd gone to Athens beforehand, and he got into a discussion. They have a discussion hill, the Areopagus, in Athens, and he went in and discussed it with the leaders there. That's kind of like the old Speaker's Corner was in Hyde Park in London, in England, where you could come and debate these things. And some people were very taken by what he said. Other people thought the idea of resurrection after death was ridiculous. And so he went on and he made fun of them having an idol to the unknown God. He said, if you don't have a God, what do you have another idol for it? It didn't kind of make any sense, and it's a good point. Then he goes down to Corinth. Corinth is just below Athens. It's down where the isthmus comes into Greece. If you know, Greece is almost divided in half by this isthmus, and Corinth is right where the isthmus is. There's a canal there now that there wasn't in Paul's day. And he starts his missionary work there. He begins to convert people, and again, there's another riot where the Jewish people attack him, and they grab him and take him off to the governor and said, this guy's saying this and this and this. And the governor says, buzz off. You know, why are you telling me to get involved in all these word fights inside your group? This is not a crime. This is a fight for you all. Buzz off and leave me alone. I gave it a 21st century American vernacular. It basically was saying, quit bothering me with this. So that was a good way to handle it. And that was actually fairly typical of the Roman attitude toward Christians at this time. The Jewish religion was tolerated religion of the Roman Empire. The Romans knew how old Judaism was, went way back before the empire. And Christianity in this era, in the middle of the first century, was regarded simply as a reform movement inside Judaism, and therefore Just leave us alone. You don't want to fight over whether you're resurrected or not. Do it and stay out of the way and leave us alone. So it actually gave a nice 30 or 60-year window where they could start growing. And then when they got large enough that they began to separate from Judaism, that the Romans finally noticed it 30 or 40 years later. And there in Corinth, he meets a person named Apollos. Apollos apparently a very articulate speaker of Christianity, but he was not imbued with the Holy Spirit. It's an interesting point. He had been baptized in John's baptism, and he said, no, he didn't have the Holy Spirit. So he and his followers, Paul, baptized them with the Holy Spirit, and they became even more skillful in their presentations and in their Christianity. So it's a very interesting story. And Apollos appears in Paul's letters. We don't really know much about him. The legend is that he was originally a Jewish person who became converted, who was from the Alexandria area. We don't really know. Some people think he wrote Hebrews, the book that we have in the New Testament now. I don't really know. I don't know who wrote Hebrews. And then Paul goes back to Ephesus. Ephesus was a major city on the Turkish coast, about halfway up between the lower part and up closer to Constantinople, which was Byzantium in those days, up toward Troy. And it was a major port city. It's now abandoned. The harbor silted up a long time ago. And he's there, and he has, again, the problem of starting to convert people. And as he converts people, he gets inside other people's business. So the people who make the silver idols, there's a big temple to the goddess Diana in Ephesus. It was a very sophisticated city, actually, and their business starts to drop. A reform movement can really irritate people if you cut into their business, to their income. Love of money is the root of all evil. We all know that. And so they attack the silversmiths, start a riot, and they grab a bunch of the Christians and they drag them to the theater. Now, actually, I've been in that theater. It's a 25,000-seat Greek amphitheater on the hillside. Really impressive, great acoustics like the great theaters already had. And basically the town clerk comes and talks them out of this. Cut this out. This is not worth writing about. If this is a legal thing, you take them, have them arrested by the authorities, et cetera, cut it out. So that calms him down, gets him out of that situation. And he travels back to Jerusalem to begin to deal with. He has a situation where there's a series of towns where somebody will be plotting against him, so they move him along to another one. Finally, he decides to leave them and return to Jerusalem. Now, if you read the account along the way, when he'll do this journey, he'll have these companions, and then this next journey, he'll have 2 or 3 other companions, and then Luke appears because he starts saying we instead of they. So you can see that his travel companions are dropping in and dropping out. As I read this, I think Paul was such a driven, capable, dynamic person. It was probably very difficult being one of his followers. People that are that dynamic are often very sure of themselves, which I'm certain he was. And so it's an interesting observation that he goes through his followers, kind of looks like he wears them out and they have to drop out and go recover. But he goes back to Jerusalem for a final visit. He leaving Ephesus, and they sail down the coast, and Luke describes this in detail, how they go around Cyprus and down to these various cities. And they land in the Caesarea area and head on up to Jerusalem to meet again with James and the pillars, as he called them, the elders. And this was simply to confirm the situation that he's in, the policy of reaching out to the Gentiles and bringing them to Christianity, baptizing them into the faith, and having this compromise on the restrictions on their behavior. When he gets into the temple area, they're laying in wait for him. Some of the Jewish rabble-rousers, they say he's brought an uncircumcised person into the temple, which was not true. He knew better than to do that. He had himself purified before he got to Jerusalem. He had his hair cut, which was then giving up his Nazirite type of thing. So he had himself purified. It was safe to go into the temple. He still gets caught in a riot again. It really doesn't sound like it was much fun being Paul. He's constantly getting arrested, rioted, flogged, threatened. And he got caught in another riot, and the Romans come charging out to grab him, find out what's going on. And the only thing to save him was to take him back in to the Roman Praetorium there, which is what their fortification was right next to the Temple Mount, keep him safe. And that's where this reading stops. But you'll find that he remains in arrest is the future and ends up going to on to Rome. So what you have here is the long, complicated story of the very difficult missions that Paul did. He did them with enormous courage. He was arrested many times. He was beaten a number of times. He was flogged a number of times. He was threatened with death a number of times, and he just persevered. His companions dropped in and dropped out, and Luke was with him for quite a while, but he never wavered in his own commitment. And when you read Philippians, which is probably his last letter, and he's in prison, and he's tired, but he's not wavering. So it's a very good letter to read. It says it's okay to get tired. Don't waver, but it's okay to feel tired. So, and he's gone through this difficult process of really changing Christianity from a reform movement inside Judaism to a salvation movement through the Holy Spirit for the whole world. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie. It's been a pleasure again. Happy Holy Week.